That pesky histamine, it does so much good and bad stuff to the body. I mean, there's a time and a place for histamine, don't get me wrong. But my guess is that a lot of our listenership has come to hate this molecule and want to get rid of excess histamine in their body. So today we're going to be talking about an anti-histamine diet and antihistamine nutrients and what this might look like in your actual life. So Amy, do you want to open us up with why do we care about histamine for the people who might not have explored this as of yet?
Yeah, I mean, I think that histamine is something when we're talking about an IBS population, there tends to be a little bit more of mucosal immune activation and like mucosal kind of inflammation. And histamine is one of those molecules that can be at play that seems to be elevated in IBS patients compared to controls, people that don't have IBS. So it's sort of showing that, there's some more immune activation in IBS individuals that leads to a little bit more inflammation and seems to be linked to potentially things like hypersensitivity, pain signaling, maybe some intolerances to foods, things like that. So I do think histamine, definitely there seems to be a link between IBS. I don't think every patient has histamine issues that are going to be outright something they need to address head on. Sometimes it's more about addressing the general health and wellness, and anything related to histamine will just naturally go down. I think for the majority of cases it's like that. Now some people might have outright more intense histamine symptoms, and that might need a little bit more nuance and tweaking when it comes to a histamine approach. But yeah, I think generally thinking of why more people with IBS might need to pay attention to histamine is just that there tends to be more of this like immune activation going on, this inflammation at the gut lining, which can lead to more histamine-esque symptoms.
Yeah, and it's very relevant for this group of people who are listening to us right now. And like you said, not everybody has like full-blown mast cell activation disease or something like that, but I would say a pretty fair chunk of the people we work with have some degree of a histamine burden. I like that you already brought up, though, that for a lot of people, if they just get their other ducks in a row, that will have an antihistamine effect, and then they might not have to treat the histamine in and of itself necessarily. So that's a really important point to make this early on.
Yeah, and I think that that's something maybe to assess in general. If you're someone that's having more severe like flushing or itching or allergenic type symptoms with some of the foods you're eating, maybe it makes sense to do like cut out some of the big histamine foods, or like do some more modulation with histamine right out the gate. But I think for a lot of people, it's like there might be some minor symptoms, and you could invest a lot of energy to try to mitigate those minor symptoms. Or again, you could invest the majority of your energy into the underlying root causal things that are probably leading to more histamine or mast cell activation, things like that. Yeah, and generally you're gonna see improvements. So yeah, there is variance in maybe how you approach it, and the severity I think does maybe matter. Some people, same thing with like using FODMAP as a tool. We're not necessarily huge proponents of going into that right away. For some individuals, it might make sense to do like a 2 to 4 week reduction if their symptoms are really intense of FODMAPs, and just letting kind of things like immune activation and inflammation lessen. Same thing I think goes with someone that might be having more severe histamine issues, but I still think that that's a huge minority.
Well, and I'll paint this picture for you, right? And I'm going to actually lead with a slight plug, if I may. So the doors to FODMAP Freedom opened actually today. So August 19th, today we're opening. We're going to be open for enrollment for about a week and a half. So if you're listening right now and you're at all interested, now is your time to reach out and get that started. But in the FODMAP Freedom journey that I lead people on, we don't get to the histamine conversation, and we don't really explicitly talk about histamine and mast cells and the treatment for that stuff until week 9 out of 12. So It's kind of like the back end of the material. It's very like fine-tuning, sexy kind of stuff in my mind. But I do that for a couple of reasons. The biggest one is that most people, the degree of histamine issue that they have can be resolved if they work on the stuff in the first half of the program. So things like sleep, stress, nutrition, that the unsexy basics that we talk about all day, every day on this podcast. So even people who have moderate symptoms or like more notable symptoms that are histaminic, most people can treat their histamine issue by not actually treating the histamine issue at all.
Right.
But for example, in this previous class that we just finished up with, we did have one student whose symptoms were quite a bit more severe, and it smelled histaminic to me right out the gate. And my nutritionist who works with me agreed. Like, we were talking about his case and we're like, yeah, it really seems like there's a strong histamine thing going on. And he was not aware of that. He had never explored that option. So for him, we gave him the additional guidance and support, and we encouraged him to reach out to his primary care and try to do a trial of cromulin. And like, he's still in the process of getting a hold of that. But again, for most people, even the people who have more moderate symptoms or who are aware that they have a histamine issue and they've already like fallen down this rabbit hole, we have found really, really great results with those people when they just do the other stuff. And by the time you get to the histamine content, you don't need like 10 supplements for the histamine problem. You maybe would benefit from taking a little bit of quercetin and then kind of calling it a day. It's much more efficient, and it's much more root causal. It's like getting to the root of the root of the root, which we brought up that idea here on the podcast before.
Right. For sure. And again, I think today we're mainly wanting to focus too on just like how nutrition really affects the histamine, how histamine's being metabolized in the body. And when you sort of focus on histamine strictly from a restriction standpoint of, I just need to lower histamine from my bucket from the foods I'm eating. First off, it's not the only source of where histamine's coming from in the body, which is super important to acknowledge. So you could be putting all this time and energy into lowering your food-based histamine sources. But in reality, if you're having tons of histamine production from your cells, that might help a little bit, but still is not going to push the needle a ton. So, I think the food strategies could make sense, especially the biggest culprits like aged foods, fermented foods, those types of things, again, might make sense to cut back for a bit. But you need nutrition to fuel your body to break down histamine, and you get yourself into such a weird situation if you don't have the nutrients to make things that break down histamine or that are important for metabolizing histamine or clearing histamine. If you don't have nutrition on board, it's just going to create a bigger hurdle for you. And the more you restrict, the less nutrition you have on board. So it's similar to the FODMAP and restriction for SIBO or IBS specific things. Like, the more you restrict, the more potential holes you could be digging for yourself over time. There's a time and place, and maybe a little restriction could go a long way. But primarily focusing on eliminating every histamine contributor possible is probably not the best strategy when it comes to histamine.
Agreed. And it is sort of reminiscent of using a quote-unquote SIBO diet to try to starve or treat SIBO. Like, this is something that's very widely shared and stated as fact on the broader internet and in the functional integrative space. But when you get into the actual research, there's absolutely no research indicating that we can starve SIBO or influence it with our diet in that way.
Right.
And similarly, we could talk about this in another episode down the road, but there's really not great evidence, and it's very inconsistent evidence as to which foods actually contain histamine and which ones might be histamine liberators. And, then you fold in the idea of individual allergies and sensitivities for that one individual person. And it's really quite a bit messier. Like you go on the internet and you can find any number of resources, ironically, one of mine included. Like I have a handout that I give people that's like, these are the foods that contain histamine and these are the foods that are not going to have histamine. And it's, I share that with a little asterisk, knowing that it's not quite that clear cut and templated. But yeah,
Right.
that's a whole nother wild card. Is like you sink all of this time, money, and effort into dialing in your low histamine diet so perfectly, but you're probably cutting out foods that you actually don't have to. And you might even be missing a few foods that didn't appear on any of these lists, and you're kind of oblivious. So I think that the better strategy is what we're going to talk about today, which is leading with antihistamine nutrients and helping your body and helping your microbiome process and cope with the histamine once it is generated. Because that's another angle too. Not only do you get histamine from your diet and your cells, namely mast cells, but also you can get histamine that's produced by your gut microbiota. And that's something that we have very, very, very little research on at this point. So I don't think that that's really worthy of a full episode discussion. We'll probably talk about it next time. But that's a whole other angle too, is like your microbiome could be generating and degrading histamine. So you sure as hell want to have a really healthy, diverse, resilient microbiome to process any histamine that's being generated there.
Yeah, for sure. And I'd imagine too, like even if the microbes might not necessarily inherently be generating histamine, they could be leading to more histamine production in your gut if they're affecting inflammation and immune function and things like that. So yeah, I think that's a good point. But I agree that we're still kind of learning to what degree and what microbes are going to be bigger histamine contributors versus not.
Yeah. Right now, sorry if I may interrupt you on that point. If people, pardon me, if people are curious, there's one or maybe two studies that are starting to indicate that there's one species of Klebsiella that can generate histamine. That doesn't mean that all Klebsiella genus members are going to do this, but there's one study. It was in a very, very, very small cohort, I think like 10 people or maybe fewer. And there was only one person in that small cohort that was really a super producer of histamine. But we're starting to get little whispers of that in the medical literature. I think in 5 or 10 years, maybe we'll know more. But I want to actually bring about another point, and you kind of brushed up against it enough that it reminded me of this. Histamine issues can be seen. You could say that they're inflammatory. You could say that it's immune activation, right? It's not autoimmune. That's a different flavor, but it is in that like immune activation, inflammatory kind of family of stuff. And you could kind of classify them as allergies or like quasi-allergy stuff.
Kind of like trying to protect you from foreign intruders, or what it kind of labels as something that could potentially be an invader or something, a threat to the body. It's kind of
absolutely. And honestly, you could say the same thing about autoimmunity. It's just that the assumption that your thyroid is a bad guy is erroneous, but your immune system is still trying to protect you from a perceived threat. It's just that its perception of the threat is incorrect. But what I was going to say is that being in this family of like immune activation, but also allergic reactivity, we start to bring up this idea of immune tolerance. So your immune system is very, very smart, and it should know enough that it can activate when there's a true threat, right? Like if you got exposed to a parasite or E. coli or Vibrio cholera, you would want your immune system to activate and fight that for you. But your immune system should be smart enough and tolerant enough that it can tolerate benign stuff, such as your own tissue, your food, things like pollen and dander, basically anything that's not actually a threat to you and it's not going to kill you or harm you. Your immune system should know enough to stand down, and it should tolerate that thing. Well, you can lose immune tolerance in a couple of different ways. You can lose immune tolerance to self-tissue, which is what we would call autoimmunity, right? If your immune system is no longer tolerating your thyroid and it's attacking it, that's a loss of immune tolerance. You can also lose immune tolerance to food and develop an allergy or sensitivity. You could develop an allergy to something like dander or dust, but it's all under this bigger umbrella of loss of immune tolerance. Well, we know pretty solidly at this point some of the things that cause a loss of immune tolerance, and really high on that list is dysbiosis, more specifically, a microbiota that is not diverse, not resilient, and not stable. So when we restrict the diet, I'm finally coming full circle. I know I just talked for like 15 minutes. But so coming full circle, the point is when we restrict our diet, not only are we going to rob ourselves of nutrients, many of which are necessary to process and degrade and excrete histamine, but also we start narrowing the prebiotics and the fibers and the polyphenols that give our microbiota food and stimulation. And now we're altering the quality and the quantity of signals that our immune system is receiving. And now that loss of microbiota diversity directly leads to a loss of immune tolerance. And that's going to translate to you narrow your diet, which narrows your microbiome, which alters the signaling to your immune system, which results in more allergies and histamine issues and things like autoimmunity and inflammation.
Right.
And then, of course, the poor person feels worse. So what do? They go back to restricting their diet even harder. And down we dig into the depths of despair until you've dug a hole so deep, you're in the middle of the earth and you're wondering why you're hitting magma. But
right.
There's also that angle, even before we get into vitamins and minerals and that sort of angle. It's like you need to have fiber and diversity on board to regulate and educate your immune system and keep it tolerant of the world around it.
Right. Very, very good point. But yeah, I think that any sustained, more extreme restrictive diet is going to be problematic for so many reasons. And I think I like that you brought it full circle from the dysbiosis standpoint and the diversity of the microbiome angle, and how that's going to affect the immune response in the gut and lead to potentially more histamine issues. And then it's kind of like a vicious cycle because then you cut out more foods and it gets a little out of control. But go ahead.
Briefly, that actually does bring us around to our first two nutrients that we might want to strongly consider for people, which are vitamin D and vitamin A. Both of those fat-soluble vitamins are very important for the regulation of immune tolerance specifically. So by nature of that, they will have an anti-inflammatory and an antihistamine effect.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I know before we jumped on, I said that there was a video Chris Masterjohn put out. He didn't mention vitamin D, but he did mention vitamin A, and the video is called 7 Steps to Cure Histamine Intolerance. And it's good advice. Again, he goes over a lot of nutrients related and that are needed to make the enzymes that break down histamine that are going to be helpful for clearing histamine. And one thing he mentioned, especially about vitamin A, is he said vitamin A deficiency appears to increase mast cells. I think he called it mast cell burden. So he also mentioned that selenium fell into that camp too, when you look at the studies that actually lower or that have been shown to kind of increase mast cells. Those were the two that he isolated, which again is interesting that you bring up vitamin A because he mentioned that in his video as well. I hadn't heard as much about selenium, or I never know how to pronounce. Is it selenium or selenium?
I think it's a potato,
okay.
tomato kind of situation. Although, you know what? I did learn something interesting from a FODMAP Freedom student not that long ago. So we had a retired PhD microbiologist go through the program. And I got to chat with him quite a bit. And he mentioned, oh, I noticed that you pronounce it Candida, but I would pronounce it Candida. And he made a point of saying in Europe, they would say Candida typically, but also in a research setting, they usually pronounce it Candida. But in in a clinical setting and on like the broader internet, a lot of people say Candida. And he's like, it's not that one's correct and one's incorrect. It's just interesting that different circles will pronounce it differently. So because he was, again, in microbiology and he was a researcher, he like grew up, so to speak, calling it Candida, which I thought was interesting. So yeah, I think I usually say selenium, but I don't know.
Right. That's what I used to say. That's what I usually say. Yeah. Selenium, not like selenium, but when I heard it come out, I was like, "Ooh, is it selenium or selenium?" I don't know.
It makes me wonder. The only thing that I could think of with selenium and where the relevance might pop up, and I'll have to check out his video and see if he mentions it. But the thing that pops into my mind is glutathione production, because glutathione is another. It's something that our body makes, so I hesitate to call it a nutrient, but glutathione is a detoxifier. It's the master antioxidant, and it is needed for inducing immune tolerance and like regulating your immune response. And you do need selenium to make glutathione, so that might be where that comes into play. It also
He doesn't mention it in. It's his Chris Master John Light, like we were saying before. The details, schmeetails.
Just tell me what works.
Right, is his little slogan. So he just kind of rattles stuff off.
Okay.
So I'd have to kind of investigate further too, but you're going to hear us rattle off a bunch of nutrients, I think, to that are needed, and probably the main gist is that you need all these nutrients to some degree. Yeah. But yeah, he didn't give specifics, just that, there seems to be links between deficiency and an increase in mast cells.
Okay. I mean, I'll bet you $1 that that's what the mechanism is. Not that it really matters. I think the point still remains that you want to get enough selenium in your diet, and that's kind of the end of that. But yeah, it's interesting to speculate. And honestly, bringing glutathione into the loop, it brings up maybe the importance of protein even.
Right.
To, before we even get into vitamins and minerals in depth, even just a simple macronutrient like protein, because you need glutamine, glycine, and cysteine, the 3 amino acids, and again, selenium as a cofactor, but you need those backbones to make glutathione. So if you are eating a diet that is too low in protein, or if you're overly relying on protein sources that don't have enough cysteine, that tends to be the rate limiter here. That could actually cause a dip in your glutathione, and then maybe that comes into play. I'll throw out one other one. So kind of the quadfecta of potential supplements for inducing immune tolerance, in my mind at this point, are vitamin A, vitamin D, glutathione, or, a precursor or something to support glutathione, and butyrate. Mm-hmm. And again, butyrate and short-chain fatty acids, these are some of the things that your microbiota would make for you when you eat FODMAPs.
Right.
Look, I have my You Can Eat FODMAPs t-shirt on today, for crying out loud. But this is why it's such a big goal for us to help you diversify your diet and eat the FODMAPs again and reintroduce carbs, because eating high FODMAP, high carb foods is going to give you the fuel you need to make short-chain fatty acids. And when your microbiome gifts you those short-chain fatty acids, including butyrate, that tells the immune system to stand down and be more tolerant of the things that it should be able to tolerate. So it's great for this like allergy, quasi-allergy kind of stuff.
Right. I wholeheartedly agree.
You can take all the quercetin capsules in the entire world, but it's not going to mean diddly squat if you're eating 10 foods and you're terrified of your food and you get no fiber in your diet.
Right.
Just the reality of it.
True that.
But do you want to roll right into some vitamins and minerals? We could kind of rattle them off rapid fire, and then we'll maybe talk about some of the themes and some of the overarching.
Yeah. Well, I might think of it too, like, in terms of different nutrients, thinking of nutrients that are going to help break down histamine, especially like outside cells, is going to be more of like DAO, or the enzyme that like mainly, again, it gets released inside the gut to help kind of break down histamine. There's a number of enzymes, or there's a number of nutrients that are going to help with DAO production. The big three, I would say, I think there was a few more. I know you had shared a document with me, but the big three that I could see were copper, vitamin C, and B6 seemed to be really important for DAO production. I think there were a few other B vitamins maybe on your slides. But yeah, I think that, potentially working on nutrition that might raise your DAO could help with histamine related symptoms. I know, again, like DAO supplements are really big, but if you're not eating enough nutrition,
expensive though.
Well, they're expensive. And then if you're not eating enough nutrition to potentially make DAO, it's like, is it better to focus on things that might raise your own production, or just that kind of supplement and never fix maybe some nutritional concerns that could be, affecting your ability to make DAO?
Well, I think this is another good example of kind of a crutch or a cheat code.
Right.
Right. And we're not knocking DAO supplements at
Right.
all. Actually, they could be quite useful. But, what we have seen a good amount is that somebody will take a DAO enzyme and it works for them, but then they still stay on a super restrictive diet and their sleep sucks and their stress is really high and they're not moving and they're not getting enough fiber. And it's like, how much heavy lifting do you expect that pill to do for you if you're not doing the harder work, the more root causal
Right.
work? So by all means, versus if you used it in this kind of scenario, if somebody started taking DAO and it helped them tolerate food a little bit better, so then they got brave enough to diversify their diet a bit and maybe introduce like a new prebiotic supplement or a probiotic, and maybe that gets them another 10% of the way there. So now they can diversify their diet a little bit more. I could see a scenario where a DAO supplement could be a really useful stepping stone to get you to where you ultimately want to be. But I've also seen many, many more people where they take a supplement, it works for them, and then they just stay on it and they're still on their restricted diet. They're still terrified of food. They're not dealing with their stress. They're not dealing with any of their baggage and their shit. And again, it's like, how much do you really want that pill to do for you?
Right.
And again, it's like $1 or $1.50 per pill. I think before all of the crazy inflation really kicked off in the last few years, I remember maybe 3-4 years ago, I was pricing DAO and I remember thinking, man, it's like $1.25 a pill. So I can only imagine what they cost now
Right.
in this day and age with all the inflation going up.
Right.
So yeah, but the ones that I had written down from my notes, and actually I pulled this right out of FODMAP Freedom, and the references that I had in that course. So vitamin C, vitamins B2 and B6, magnesium, and copper. But I think you hit the nail on the head. I think that the three that you said, B6, copper, and vitamin C, are probably, that's what you see more so. And I think I've heard a lot of stories of people increasing vitamin C, and then that helps with histamine symptoms.
Right.
So those are probably the heavy hitters. And then maybe riboflavin and magnesium are a little bit less important. Maybe. I don't know. But get all of them, people.
Well, again, I think it's a scenario too of like, in reality, if you were to go to Chronometer and kind of look at your intake of some of these nutrients, if you're dealing with more histamine symptoms, maybe you could zero in a bit on some of these specific ones. But I think generally getting all the nutrients makes sense. But you might notice like, I typically don't get quite as much vitamin C. Some people that might be having more outright histamine issues might need a little bit more during a period where you're kind of investigating or figuring out what's going to work and what's not going to work. I do think sometimes people might need a little bit more of some of these things to kind of get you over a hump, or maybe there's a microbiome issue that's kind of creating some histamine stuff. So like maybe you're blowing through vitamin C more quickly. So again, I think that there's some nuance, but I think if you're pretty much covering most of these nutrients we're mentioning intake-wise, you're probably going to be doing pretty good. And then from there, you could maybe tweak your strategy slightly, but actually investigating and seeing, am I getting these things? Instead of being like, oh, I think I'm covered, which I think there's a lot of that just because there's so much burnout on the diet side because it's so restrictive and stressful that sometimes trying to investigate it from the angle of actually nourishing can feel like a little overwhelming to a degree. But I think it's super important to first even just assess your intake of some of these things before doing anything else.
Well, I'm picturing, here's yet another metaphor to throw into our library that's probably a million metaphors deep at this point. When I hear people say, I think I'm getting enough of that, fiber, protein, vitamin B6, whatever, pick your nutrient. But when I hear that, and I know damn well that they have not done the tracking that I recommended that they do, I start to get a little bit twitchy now. Because I know from my personal experience, right? You went on this roller coaster with me. It was at some point after we started podcasting together. So I remember telling you point blank to your face, 100% serious. I was like, I get enough dietary iron. Absolutely, I do. And I know stuff about nutrition. I do. And I eat red meat and I eat spinach and all the things. And then I did Chronometer for the first time. And I realized, oh, I actually do not. I was humbled. And I do this for a damn living. So, just track stuff at least a little bit. But I'm picturing the metaphor here is it's almost like you go through all of school and you take math classes, but you never have any quizzes or exams or SATs or Regents exams. And you just get all the way up through high school. And then you're like applying for colleges and you tell them, yeah, I think I know math. Like I know math. I'm fine at math. And, there's going to be some bell curve, right? They're going to get students they're going to get a lot of people who are kind of mediocre at math. They're going to get a couple of kids that are genuinely really good at math despite never being tested. But they're going to get a pretty good chunk of people who absolutely do not know freaking math. And I feel like that's kind of what we're dealing with. But take that bell curve and now skew it lower because we are dealing with people who are sick. So the likelihood is much higher that you have a nutritional deficiency because you don't feel good and you've been on a restricted diet for a prolonged period of time. So it's frustrating though when I hear people say, oh, I think I'm getting enough B6. Well, how do you know, man? Like,
I always hear that with overall calories. They're like, oh, I'm eating enough. And I'm like, I don't know.
Are you?
Considering like probably 80% of my patients aren't eating enough, you see the trend enough to where, I think we all have our own bias and that's just inherent. I don't think it's anything to like shame yourself about or judge yourself, but just know that we have some of these, as you like to call them, brain lesions that might lead us astray or lead us to believe something that is not true. And might hold you back in a way. So I think the more kind of open-minded you can be about like nourishing and kind of providing your body with what it needs.
Well, case in point, when I was convinced that I ate enough dietary iron, but my ferritin was a little bit lower than I'd like to see it, I started thinking about things like, oh, is my absorption bad? And do I need to take a supplement and like cofactors? And I was getting into fancy stuff when I really just needed to eat more iron. And similarly, it's like the kid who gets all the way through high school, never ever having a math test. And then what if they get to college? And, this scenario that I painted, it's like if they had had some examinations, if they had had some check-ins, they would know, oh, I actually kind of suck at math. Or, oh, I'm actually not understanding long division at all. And they could intervene and they could get the help then and there instead of making it all the way through calculus and getting to like college engineering level classes and then realizing that they suck at long division. It's like you're so much better off if you can assess objectively early on and kind of nip it in the bud, so to speak. And what's fun? Hold on. I just had an epiphany, Amy. Oh my God.
Oh boy.
Ready?
Okay.
Ready?
I don't know if I'm ready. I'm going to strap my seatbelt in.
This is a group of people who are so keen on objective measurements. They want to order all the damn GI maps, SIBO tests, OAT tests, thyroid tests, You tell this group of people that they need an objective laboratory test, and they are all for it. They are all too keen to give their pee, their poop, their blood, their urine, their whatever in the name of science. All the fluids and all the semi-fluids, right? The mushes. That type of objective measurement our people love and obsess over. But the minute we tell them to do something on chronometer, it's like, no, I don't want to.
Well, I think it to a degree, I still think the lab test in their mind probably isolate like a problem that that's a little bit more concrete sometimes, but still it isn't. It's a lot of times like, you having a little bit extra Klebsiella on your stool test, is that really objectively saying that all your symptoms are linked to that? Just like, again, like I think sometimes people can't really comprehend or maybe wrap their head around what it means to be deficient in thiamine across time. Like, I just don't think there's quite as much marketing around that versus the marketing around the testing. But I totally get what you're saying. Like, this is data. In the same way that is data.
This is an objective test that you could do for free or cheap at home. Right. And it takes less time than driving to the LabCorp, getting your blood drawn and driving home.
Right. But it's just not as scary, I feel like, or like, again, as I don't know. I think the marketing is the best way to think about it. Like, there's so much marketing around like dysbiosis and the microbiome being so problematic, or like, something on the OAT test coming up, arabinose or whatever on the OAT test coming up. Then you have candida. Like, again, like there's so many, so much marketing around that's like scary and kind of more urgent and like isolates a boogeyman.
Well, it's kind of feeding into the health anxiety kind of stuff, right? Like, there's something wrong with you. Here's the bad guy. Here's the label. And now we're going to fix it. We're going to treat it. Like, that world, I think, makes a lot of sense to people who have a lot of health anxiety, which is, as a side note, very common in the IBS, SIBO, tummy problem kind of world. Versus, I think part of it, maybe too, and this is a tangent, we'll get back to nutrients in a second, but maybe a part of it too is that what's going to come out of doing a chronometer assessment, right? I think for the people we work with, maybe there's this element of like ignorance is bliss. Like, oh, if I don't know it, then I don't have to address it. But also, if I acknowledge that my diet is bad, I kind of have to acknowledge that me and my behavior and my choices are part of the problem.
Right.
So maybe there's like an ownership kind of issue. And then also, I think playing into the food fear thing, a lot of our people are so deeply, deeply, deeply terrified of diversifying their diet and adding foods in. It's like, okay, well, what if I'm deficient in thiamine? Oh my God, the scary dietitian lady is going to make me introduce foods that contain thiamine. And I don't want to do that. Right. So I don't know. I don't know what all the psychology is, but it's very interesting to see because, again, like, people will run off to LabCorp and donate their blood lickety split without thinking twice. But, trying to get people to do chronometer is like pulling damn teeth.
Yeah.
Anyhow.
No, I hear you.
To circle us back to DAO briefly, I wanted to make one more point about this particular enzyme. Like you said, it's the enzyme outside of the cells and it's going to degrade histamine. This is going to be really a big one for histamine coming in through food as opposed to histamine that's made by your mast cells. It's worth noting too, though, that DAO is a brush border enzyme, which means your production of DAO is likely to go down if you have a leaky, inflamed gut.
Right.
So sometimes just healing leaky gut and doing things like zinc carnosine, glutamine, slippery elm, like those sorts of things can maybe go a ways. But also keep in mind, the reason you got the leaky gut is almost always because of dysbiosis, inadequate fiber, nutrient deficiencies, stress chemistry, poor sleep. It's the same crap we talk about all day, every day that's going to cause leaky gut. So again, doing the unsexy basics, as we call them, is really going to be the root of the root of the root, including the leaky gut piece of this puzzle.
Right. Very, very good point. I'm glad you brought that up. I think that I know one thing we haven't talked as much about is like methylation being really important for, eliminating histamine from things like your mast cells. So again, like in terms of helping with eliminating histamines, especially inside the cell, I mean, that's really every B vitamin, really. I feel like you're going to need every B vitamin if you're not methylating super well. So again, it's just, we're broadening the idea of just like you pretty much need all the nutrients. Now there are specific ones that might be more beneficial. And again, we might not have research about some random effect that manganese has on histamine that we just don't know yet. So again, you do want to potentially look at nutrition as a whole and kind of work on that as a whole, and you'd probably make progress histamine wise. But like when you're talking about methylation, that's like, okay, you're going to run down the list of all the B vitamins that you're going to need. And again, how often do I review people's diets and they're low in a lot of B vitamins? Often. So nutrient gaps and deficiencies are super common. So like I said, the more you can look into it, kind of see where you're falling, the better your mast cells are going to function.
Yeah. And to be honest, to paint a picture here, I mean, again, I do this for a damn living, and I still have a couple of things nutritionally that I'm working on.
Right.
I crush it with fiber. I hit calories nail on the head almost every single day of my life, minus when I go to the all-you-can-eat seafood buffet. But that's another story. But it's like there are some things that come really easily to me now, and there are still some things that I'm focusing more on, like iron. I'm still kind of working on the iron thing. And part of it is I'm moving as slow as molasses on a cold winter day. And now we're in the middle of summer and we're traveling a lot. So I have not cooked the liver yet. 2024, Amy, this is going to be the year that I learn how to cook liver and make it palatable. It's going to happen. It's just a matter of when. But I vowed that at the new year, and it's going to happen. But, I guess my point is that really none of us are perfect, myself included. I don't know if that's enough to cause a lot of dysfunction or disease in my body, the level that I'm at right now, but I still am looking to improve my nutrition. So if I, the professional, the expert, is admitting to you right now that I have nutritional gaps that I'm working on, I would bet you $5 that you, the listener, do as well. So just take our word for it. Look at Chronometer, give it a try. It's not going to bite you, I promise.
Right. It's funny you bring up liver. Just as a very brief side tangent, there is an expression in Farsi, and I can't remember exactly how to pronounce it, so I'm not even going to try, but it means like you are my liver, but it's a term of endearment.
Okay.
Is how it directly translates, but I think it basically means like you're my heart, but it translates into you're my liver. So it's really funny. It's in one of Cece's books. There's like a Goodnight June instead of Goodnight Moon, the kids book. June means like love in Farsi. But that always cracks me up. So
you realize, by the way, from now on, I'm calling you my liver.
Okay.
Because I'm like, oh, what do we do now? My sweet, my buttercup. Like I have all of these pet names for you, and now you're going to have to be my liver.
Right.
Another one to date myself maybe slightly is there was an episode, I'm trying to think, I'm pretty sure it was Friends, that I forget which character it was now. I forget the story, but basically, you're my lobster.
Yeah.
Is another term of endearment here.
I think that was that Phoebe that said something?
I feel like it has to be a Phoebe thing.
Right.
It's weird enough that it has to be a Phoebe thing.
Right.
But yeah, I'm going to have to revisit the you are my lobster.
Right.
And it's like, you're my person.
Right.
But it was a weirder version of that. Yeah, I'll have to rewatch that one. But anyway, I think kind of circling back up here, I guess the point that we're trying to make here is that you need just about every single vitamin and mineral to really process histamine and get rid of it and keep your mast cells healthy and happy and tolerant of the world around them and keep inflammation down. So, and like heal the gut lining so that you can make DAO. So there's a lot of different nutrients that are necessary or at least intertwined in this histamine cascade. So again, like do the work, get on Chronometer, suck it up, go on Chronometer, see if you have any deficiencies and start working on that either on your own or with a professional. You do you. But one final angle that I wanted to share here as we start to wind down for the episode is this angle of trying to get antihistamine compounds in your diet, not in the sense of vitamins, minerals, calories, macros, but in the sense of things like quercetin and luteolin. And there probably are other molecules like polyphenols that would have an antihistamine, capability to them, and we're just not aware of that yet.
Right.
But would you agree that quercetin in particular is a very useful supplement that people can take for histamine issues?
Yeah, for sure. I think quercetin's great. Another one sometimes I'll have people do is like nettle tea. I've had people feel like that was an easy thing to add into their diet that seems to help with
cheap, very nutritive,
right.
Lots of minerals. Yeah, nettle is fantastic.
So that's another one sometimes if I have, especially if someone's not like, I don't know if they necessarily need a supplement, but they might need a little bit of extra support. It's like, oh, let's just throw a tea in and see if that generally helps symptoms, or if they're sensitive to things. I'm like,
nettle grows everywhere too. Right. So, or at least I should say here in the United States, it's very easy to go out and forage and find. Obviously, you have to be careful picking it because they call it stinging nettle for a reason. So wear gloves. But yeah, you can look up online videos and pictures of what nettle looks like, and you could potentially go out in your backyard or in the woods surrounding your house. Obviously, our people in like New York City or LA is probably not going to be able to do this, but a lot of people would be able to just go out into their neighborhood or their yard or the woods and pick nettle when it's in season.
Yep.
And then you could either dry it or you could make it into like, I've seen it used in sort of like a pesto type recipe. I've seen it used as a filling that you put in ravioli. I've seen it used in soup, and you like blend the heck out of it and make a nettle and I think potato soup. So really you could use nettle culinarily as a food, or you could drink it as tea, in which case it is, the dried nettle leaf will last in your cupboard for eons, probably. And again, it's very nutritive. It's very rich in minerals. So that's a really great option.
Yeah. So I do like that one. The quercetin, do you have like foods that are higher in quercetin? I know like onions or apples are fairly high in quercetin.
Yeah. And I'm going to cheat and I'm going to look off screen a little bit because I pulled up my little handout. I don't have it committed to memory, but believe it or not, the food that really tops the list as far as like, maybe part of it is because the serving size is a bit on the large size for this particular food, but per 100-gram serving, the highest is going to be capers, actually. So, you could get a big old jar of capers at Costco or at your grocery store and sprinkle those onto your food, but they have quite a lot of quercetin, followed by elderberries, red onion, white onion, okra, red apple, including the skin, cranberries, asparagus, goji berries, kale, blueberries, and pear. And I want to point out that a lot of those higher quercetin foods are high in FODMAPs.
Right.
So again, it's like bringing this back to you really want to have a diverse diet. And, it makes me weep and shudder a little bit when I have somebody come in and they're like, oh, I'm combining these 4 different diets. I'm doing AIP and low histamine and low oxalate and low FODMAP. Please help me. I'm eating 3 foods. And I'm like, But this is part of it is like, if you want to get antihistamine compounds in your diet, you're going to need to eat some FODMAPs.
Right.
And it's like, which of the 2 do you prioritize? Or do you just kind of nix both of them and do all of this unsexy basic stuff that we talk about? Like just making sure that you're adequately nourished, working on your sleep, your stress, your movement, your relationships, your blood sugar, all of that kind of stuff.
Agreed.
Another compound that I thought I would share is luteolin, which is another flavonoid that you can find in food. You could certainly get this as a supplement like quercetin, or you could get some from Reducio in particular. Reducio? How do you... I don't.
That's another one I do not know how to pronounce, but I know exactly what you're talking about.
Okay. However you pronounce that one, I'm going to go...
Makes me think of Pinocchio.
I'm going to go Reducio. I don't know. Anyway, but also olives, serrano peppers, artichokes, red grapes, celery, broccoli, kiwi fruit, melons and cantaloupe, red bell peppers, plums, and Brussels sprouts. And again, notice the theme. There's quite a lot of higher FODMAP foods that make the list for the luteolin. But again, the reducio is by far the highest. And similarly for the quercetin, capers are by far the highest, at least from the references that I pulled when I created this handout.
Right.
And then herbs and spices also. Your spice cabinet is loaded with these antihistamine compounds. So go forth, flavor your food. Don't eat bland, flavorless food. Actually, like flavor your food and put herbs and spices on them, and that will help tremendously too.
Right. I agree.
I agree. Since we're on the topic this episode about pronunciation of things, I have two that I want to share with you. But first, one of them involves, I'm going to quiz you here. How do you pronounce the first part of the small intestine?
Duodenum.
Okay. I've heard both. So I forget
now
which one's which.
I'm like overthinking now. Duodenum or duodenum. I feel like I've done both. So
yeah. So for me, I kind of feel like I grew up with a split household in this way. So in undergrad in Buffalo, New York, I was taught duodenum. But then when I went to grad school in LA, we were taught duodenum.
Right.
And I'm still confused. I don't know which one to pronounce it. So if you ever like watch me talk about the duodenum or the duodenum, I'm probably going to flip-flop my pronunciation because I've heard both. And again, neither's correct or incorrect. It's maybe like a regional thing. Right. The other one I want to share is, okay, and I'm going to quiz you again. And I think I might know which one you're going to lean towards knowing where you live. There are several types of pie that are popular around Thanksgiving time. Apple pie, pumpkin pie, and
cherry, rhubarb.
What are you doing with your life?
Pumpkin pie.
It's a nut.
Oh, pecan.
Okay. I figured you would be a pecan person. And I'm in favor of this. I applaud you for this. And I figured because you're in Cincinnati, which is practically the South. So I grew up saying pecan.
Okay, yeah.
And I laugh now because I'm like, what are we Yankees doing?
Right.
It's not a can full of pea. That sounds so horrible.
Right.
Why are we doing this to ourselves? So I am actively trying to rewire my brain, and I'm actively denying what I grew up with. I'm shoving my roots this way, and I'm embracing the South now that I live in North Carolina, and I am dead set. It is a pecan. Okay. It is not a pecan. I don't know why we were taught that in the North, that it's a pecan. That just is a dumb thing to say. So I'm team pecan from now until the end of my days. I want to say that publicly.
Okay. I'm glad we've cleared that up. Glad we've cleared the air.
Yes. But anyway, can you think of any other antihistamine diet tidbits that you would like to share?
I don't think so, like that are diet related. Maybe again in the next episode we can talk about some other things to consider. I know there's some hormonal patterns. I think that there's, stress chemistry can play a role. So there's like maybe talking about some of the other unsexy basics that get kind of overlooked for the sexy things.
And maybe I'll just plug at this point right now. I think that's a great idea for another episode, but I think it's kind of like if you hear somebody say that they're doing a diet to lose weight and the only thing they're doing is like Jenny Craig.
Right.
And they're learning nothing about nutrition. They're not exercising or moving. They're not working on their mental health. They're not doing anything else. They're just doing Jenny Craig. You and I both know that person is not super likely to keep the weight off, right? And it doesn't matter if it's like MetaFast, Weight Watchers, Jenny Craig, Whole30, it doesn't matter. Pick your diet. But when people just do a prescribed diet and they don't touch anything else or change anything else in their life or their ecosystem, they are very unlikely to succeed in the long run.
Right.
And I feel like similarly, the people who try to treat the histamine thing with a low histamine diet and they don't touch anything else about their life or their ecosystem, I think that you're going to get really limited success, and you're possibly just going to dig yourself a deeper hole like we described earlier, versus if you could do, maybe you restrict dietary histamine a little bit, and maybe you introduce antihistamine foods and work on nourishing yourself. And maybe you work on your sleep, your stress, your blood sugar, your movement, your relationships, your whatever. I feel like that type of approach is going to be much more successful, in the same way that somebody might be more successful losing weight if they adopt a healthier diet, start going to therapy, start getting a gym membership, do some physical therapy, like do all of the things, as opposed to just relying on Jenny Craig to cure all that ails you. So
Right.
Agreed. Throw that out there at this stage of the game. But before we go, I'm going to just remind people of my plug that FODMAP Freedom is enrolling right now. And this is the last time we're enrolling until 2025. So if you want to get in on it, if you want 2024 to be the last year you have to listen to this podcast, because you just are feeling so good, you don't even need to listen to us fools anymore, then get in there. It's www.fodmapfreedom.com/enroll, ENROLL. God, I'm a very bad verbal speller, but I pulled that off anyway. So go ahead and check it out. I would love to help you this fall and make sure this is the last year you have to think about IBS, SIBO, dysbiosis, or Candida. In the meantime, we will see you right back here for another episode of the IBS Freedom Podcast before you even know what happened. So until then, toodaloo.